From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies, analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your host, Meghan Pennington, a senior director here at HPS. And today I am joined by two of our partners, both of whom have a long track record in Republican and Democratic politics, Stacy Kerr and Michael Steele. The topic today is last night's debate between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. This is the final podcast in our series on the presidential and vice presidential debates. Steele and Stacy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
Good to be with you.
So last night was the much awaited rematch of President Trump and Vice President Biden. And I have to say, I was shocked by how calm it was. We saw the Presidential Commission on Debate's decision to mute microphones, and it seems like it actually opened up for some real conversation. But what did you guys think? What were your big picture? How did it go?
I think we should start, as most people are talking about this debate, to do with giving kudos to Kristen Welker and the terrific job that she did, kind of keeping us on the rails.
Plus one.
The changes in the format and the muting helped more than I honestly thought they would, but it was very much her skill and unflappable nature that kept us together. And the biggest difference, obviously, was the president himself, that his decision not to relentlessly attack, relentlessly interrupt. And it makes you wonder where he would be, where his candidacy would be if he had made this decision 6 months ago or 3 months ago or even 3 weeks ago, just allowing the debate to happen, recognizing that in some ways the former vice president is his own worst enemy, and giving him space to founder is a better strategy than relentlessly pecking at him.
Yeah, look, we definitely saw a different overall tone, no question. I still think we also saw a fairly unprepared president. I think he tried to land some attacks here for the October surprise that were just not well articulated. I don't think they made a ton of sense to people. I think Biden was very ready for them and very prepared. And look, overall, I think what has been missing from the president's reelection campaign, and we saw again what was missing from the debate last night, was a clear case to reelect this president, to articulate a plan for what he will do for the next 4 years. And he didn't do that. On the Biden side, I do think he came in as prepared as he does for debates. I think he was ready for the attacks. I actually think Biden landed some pretty strong points. And look, overall, Biden executed his strategy. He made a case against Trump. This is a referendum election, and that's the strategy. And he did it.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think one, the president came across as exactly what he is, a 70-something-year-old man who watches way too much Fox News. And a lot of the attacks that he was landing only make sense if you understand the references and the shorthand and the kind of the universe that media bubble is. I do think that the former vice president continues to make a serious error in not acknowledging that some of the attacks on his surviving son are legitimate. That if he was willing to go out there and say, like so many Americans, my son has dealt with tragedy, he has dealt with addiction, he has not always made the right choice, that has never affected my conduct in public life, and I pledge it never will when I am your president. That is just a necessary precursor to sweep away the sort of filigree of conspiracy theories and add-ons and the president's ad hominem attacks, but to address the fact that the former vice president's surviving son received money that he would not have if he had not been the former vice president's son.
Look, I think all of us have been around politics, Meghan, you and Steele and I on both the campaign side and in Congress, to know that simply doing that is not going to make these attacks go away. So I actually think that Biden's strategy to address this, which we saw last night, by saying it's not about our families, it's about you and your families to the voters, is actually a good strategy. And I think he did it again last night. And I don't think that these attacks are landing. That said, I will say anecdotally, we've heard from some friends who are, voters in Philadelphia, not really plugged into politics. And, they are definitely hearing these attacks, I think, on the ground in Pennsylvania and in the president's campaign, and, thinking about what they mean. But I'm just not sure that this has been, I don't think that this is going to be a successful game changer in the trajectory of this race.
The former vice president smiled. The president never smiled. And I think the former vice president deployed that smile very effectively at times to deflect attacks or switch the topic, or, when he felt something was too foolish or convoluted to engage with directly, just kind of flashing a grin was a really effective tactic.
Yeah, so I want to actually ask you about that, because something that I've been thinking a lot about and since the debate ended was what Donald Trump and what Joe Biden did voters want to show up last night. So I think people on the left look at Joe Biden's performance and say, we wanted him to come out as more of a bulldog, and he should bring it to Trump the way Trump can bring it. And then Trump can do that, but last night we saw a more muted version of himself. I wonder, was Trump trying to come to the middle and reach out to those folks that want to see a more civil discourse? And was Joe Biden the normal Joe Biden? Did he rise to the occasion to show that he has the energy to take on somebody like Trump? As you mentioned, Stacy, I also worked for a Delaware politician. It is true, the Delaware way, what they say, it is a let's talk about malarkey and be kind to each other, but that is not the style of President Trump. And I just wonder, how do you think, like, the personality they both brought last night, do you think they brought the right one, or did they not meet the moment in some way?
Look, I think waiting for Joe Biden to have more energy, or waiting for President Trump to have a different tone, are just, that's waiting for outcomes that are just never going to happen. Those have not been present in that race. We're unlikely to see that 3 weeks before. So while that may have been voters' expectation, or activists or party, folks in the party's expectations, I don't think that we were ever going to see a big change. And I don't think they have at this point a ton of incentive to change. We got, 45 million people have already voted. Let's not forget.
Right.
And, I watched the debate, and I started to sort of turn on the commentary or go to Twitter and see what other people were thinking. And I thought, like a little bit of a different tone, some more of the same, a little bit more substance. I think tomorrow we wake up and we continue talking about early vote lines and all the people that have already voted in this race, and nothing really changes.
Yeah, I think the president was more presidential in tone, certainly, than I expected, but the substance of his attacks remained the sort of rooted in very, very shadowy conspiracy theory and stuff that's not central to people's experience, particularly people's experience in the coronavirus, in this pandemic, and the resulting economic chaos. I think the first thing you've got to acknowledge about the former vice president is that he is not as verbally sharp or gifted as he was in 1988 or 2008. He simply isn't. He's an older man, particularly later in the debate. He got tongue-tied a little bit. He doesn't have a crisp answer for why his coronavirus response would be better than the president's, which he should. He doesn't have a crisp answer on the economy, which he should. At the same time, he is kind and decent, and you sort of expect him to end the debate by passing out Werther's Originals from his cardigan, and that sort of reassuring figure is probably the best tone right now.
Yeah, and I think it's in a week and a half we'll know if sharpness and crispness and expectations of that from a 76-year-old man are really what voters want, or if they are actually so fatigued that this is a moment for our country where they actually want empathy and compassion and some of those qualities. I think I can speak for a lot of Democrats who would say, you know what, if he can't remember everybody's name and he's not as sharp, it's not like we kind of know what we're getting from a 70-something-year-old man, and we'd much rather have somebody who actually puts people first and cares about government working for people and actually will have a plan to help people. And those are all the things that we've seen for Joe Biden.
Um, I thought it was interesting last night that the president, a number of times said to Biden, "Well, you were there for 40 years. Why didn't you get it done?" And it was really funny because he's been president for the past 4 years, and it was just this very much like I thought we were back in 2016. Look, I'm the outsider that's going to come in and shake things up. What did you all think about that? Did that land? Do you think that line of challenge to Biden sticks still because people see him as the outsider?
I mean, Trump has just been so undisciplined in delivering what might be effective,
Yeah, I totally agree.
mechanisms.
I think that if that had been the consistent line of attack, not Biden is the Trojan horse for AOC +3 or any, if the consistent line of attack is Joe's been there for 47 years and he didn't get the job done, that could be effective, but it has not been the consistent line of attack. And I actually thought some people saw this as a little bit of shade thrown towards former President Obama, but I thought his response, look, man, I was the vice president, not the president, was effective and probably the best response in that environment. And I think there is something real to the argument, and they would never make it right now, but there is something real to the argument that when the Obama administration needed to get things done on Capitol Hill that involved Republicans, they sent Joe Biden, or they didn't get done. That's the binary choice there is we either send Joe and Joe makes a deal that our base doesn't like, or it doesn't get done.
It's just a remarkably hard argument to make when, Meghan, to your point, when you've had a president who has had so many failures sitting in the office over the last 4 years. I mean, it's like, would any of us go to our clients and say, oh yeah, if you can just give us one more contract, then we'll do a good job for you. I mean, the best way to get future work or to get a future, whatever it is you want, is to prove yourself. And I think ultimately this will be a referendum on President Trump's performance, not on the 8 years of the record of the Obama-Biden White House.
Well, pivoting just a little bit before we take a break, I want to talk about Kristen Welker and moderators in general. This is the most conversation I can remember there being about moderators. Of course, we had Chris Wallace and that debate being the crazy thing that it was, and then Susan Page in the vice presidential debate, and then of course our friend Steve Scully at C-SPAN and the debate that wasn't, and then leading up to last night, President Trump wasn't pulling any punches when it came to Kristen Welker. But I want to read what Noah Oppenheim said last night about Kristen. He said, every single person at NBC News is bursting with pride. Kristen is beloved and admired by all of us, and tonight the whole country knows why. In my opinion, she did a great job. I would just love to hear what you all think about last night, and then also just about the conversation around moderators that I don't think we've seen at such a fever pitch in past election years.
Yeah, look, I think I totally agree. I think she was did a remarkable job. I thought she was terrific. I think it would be a mistake to think that her success was just a result of the mute button or changes in the format from the Presidential Debate Commission. She had control. She went in with a plan. She articulated a plan. She executed on it. I thought she was excellent. And I thought it was, a great thing to watch. I think there's going to be a lot of storylines that'll come from 2020 and this campaign that are not just about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And regardless of who wins, there's going to be some breakouts. And it's a little bit of a transition from the old white men anchors. We know many of them, and many of them are still there and playing important roles. But I thought it was both a generational and a gender shift to show that there are a lot of ways that you can conduct this. And I thought she did just an excellent, outstanding job.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump works the refs like Mike Krzyzewski. He is, in a way that I think most people holding that office would find utterly unpresidential. And so I think a lot of the debate about the moderators, a lot of that focus comes from the president and his Twitter account doing things that most people who sit behind the resolute desk would find just beneath the office of the president of the United States. All that having been said, yes, I mean, Welker took her place at the forefront of a rising generation of of newscasters, not just at NBC, but across the industry. And if there is a breakout media star of this election year right now, you have to say that it's her.
And I think those of us who have known her and watched her and worked with her expected that from her. I mean, she is a substantive, terrific journalist. And so in some ways it was what we expected from her, those of us who've been working with her, but no doubt her task was still huge and she delivered on it.
And I thought notable that leading up to last night, the defense of Kristen Welker from across the political spectrum, and the news media was robust. I mean, everybody was kind of like, listen, buddy, she's going to come and she's going to do great.
Yeah. And I think not that was, and I don't want to take anything away from her skills and abilities, but it was also kind of a real concern that the president does not deal well with women in positions of power.
Yeah.
He bristles particularly at women of color in power. And there was a real concern that this was going to be really, really ugly. And I think we're all sort of thanking God this morning that it was not as bad as it could have been on that front. And again, a lot of that has to do with her skills and abilities.
Yeah, I think so too. I was pleasantly surprised, and with Savannah Guthrie and with Kristen Welker. It's sort of sad to have to say that, but there is very much this moment of like, oh God, I hope, how bad is this going to be? Like and because he just doesn't even realize, I think, how bad he's getting sometimes.
And it's just great I think we're going to spend this weekend talking a lot about 60 Minutes. The 60 Minutes piece is going to come out, and we got a little break from that last night, but I think you'll see it again. I mean, Lesley Stahl and sort of the way her command of it. And let's not forget, I mean, Nora O'Donnell, and she interviewed Joe Biden. And, I just think it's that will be a story of 2020 or sort of the diversification and these the next generation of women stepping up.
I actually watched the 60 Minutes interview that the footage the White House posted. Watched the whole thing.
You couldn't figure out why.
It was an utterly unremarkable interview. Like her questions were tough, but generally fair. There were one or two times I thought she crossed that line. Tough, but generally fair. He clung tenaciously to his preferred narrative, as he generally does. I didn't understand why he walked off or why it became such a big deal, because it was really just him repeating the same answers that he's given hundreds of times, explaining his preferred narrative, and her kind of being incredulous that he was sticking to the story as he believes it. And
I mean, as we've said a number of times on this, it's unclear whether this president is unwilling or unable, incapable, or just unwilling to actually be disciplined and stick to a strategy. The fact is he's not, and
maybe he just thought it was a good time to pick a fight with the media. I don't know. I mean, it was just it was striking watching, the whole thing, that like this is an utterly unremarkable interview in many ways. But we'll see what Sunday looks like.
We will see. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of the substance and then where we go from here. And with November 3rd right around the corner, what we can expect the rhetoric to look like over the next 11 days.
Have you heard the news? HPS Insights is expanding into the HPS podcast channel, which offers our listeners access to all of Hamilton Place Strategy's podcast shows in one convenient place. The HPS podcast channel is home to all of our new and past podcast episodes on your favorite podcast streaming services: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google, and more. If you aren't yet subscribed to the HPS podcast channel, subscribe now to have the latest from HPS Insights and weekly HPS Macrocast episodes delivered straight to your podcast streaming service. To learn more about our podcasts and other original content, visit hamiltonplacestrategies.com/insights.
All right, we're back on HPS Insights. So now moving into the issues from last night, what did you two think? Did we have a policy discussion? Did we need to have a policy discussion? Something I've been thinking about is, in the time of COVID and this economic crisis, maybe Americans don't have the appetite to hear these, big picture vision for the country. They want to hear what the candidates are going to do right now to get us out of this dark time. And with Joe Biden say we're going into a dark period. So tell me, what did you think that we talked enough about big picture policy, or maybe was it not needed?
Well, I think it's maybe the answer to that is both. I think people ultimately do want to know what they're voting for and people's vision of the future, and obviously they have been distracted by COVID, and they want to know what the immediate response are. I think, Kristen Welker's choice to go right to COVID and ask that in a big picture sense, what will you do moving forward, was a good way to sort of bridge that. But you're right, Megan, we did see sort of the second half of the debate, especially, we saw some real differences in policy. We talked about the minimum wage, immigration, and that's just been missing from this campaign. Look, I think part of that is by design. I don't think that the Biden campaign has been incentivized to put out a bunch of policies and get criticized on them. Frankly, this is a referendum election.
Right.
So it was sort of like a surprise to see exchanges on that. I actually thought there were some high points for both of them. Both of them sort of actually articulated positions on that and showed differences. I just don't think that this is the election where that is where the Biden campaign was incentivized to do that throughout.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem in drawing real policy differences on the immediate priorities is that in the broad strokes, both candidates define their priorities very similarly. We need to do more testing, contact tracing, et cetera, to deal with the pandemic, eventually develop a vaccine, and then take measures to improve our economy and help citizens who are suffering from the economic fallout from the pandemic itself and the economic fallout. And there are incredible differences in terms of the details of what those policy responses look like, but the broad strokes are described very similarly. And the biggest difference then becomes the president's sort of irrational exuberance or irrational optimism, or perhaps lying about the speed of a vaccine and its distribution.
Yeah.
And the former vice president leaning much more heavily into public health measures and from what I've read, in my judgment, is a more realistic time frame for getting a vaccine approved and widely distributed. And so it was as much as you tried to drill down on policy on the big thing facing the country, it's a difference of detail and of tone rather than the broad strokes.
Well, I thought it was an interesting moment when he said, I would like to go hide away until this thing is gone. Joe Biden can go sit in his basement and hide it out. Do people think that Joe Biden's hiding and that Donald Trump is taking this on like head on, or is that just kind of
70 something year old white men who watch a ton of Fox News think that? Yes.
I was going to say maybe the Republican base thinks that because they've been told that, but it'd be interesting to ask that question to the literally millions of people who are standing in line for hours to early vote so far.
Well, also on that point, it's interesting how President Trump and Vice President Biden look at the numbers. So President Trump says it was projected that we would lose more than 2 million people, and look what we did. And this shows that how successful we were. And Vice President Biden came right back and said, more than 200,000 people dead, and any person who is in power and this happens on their watch should not continue to serve. Does that juxtaposition of numbers persuade anybody in the middle?
Is there anybody in the middle?
No, I don't think so. I think that I've been very frustrated. I've written about this. I've talked about this. The president and the vice president actually does it better, have a narrative about the successful prosecution of their COVID response. It's 2 million versus 200,000. If we do everything right, it'll be 200,000. Ventilators, therapeutics, Operation Warp Speed, the China travel ban. It's coherent. It sounds, you have to pick it apart factually, and neither the media nor the Democratic candidates, in my opinion, do a very good job going in and saying, on this date you said this, on this date you did this, on this date you did this, you tweeted this then. there is a factual case to be made that that at many steps along the way, they did not follow the public health authorities' advice. They did not do the right thing. They have not scaled up testing the way they should. But it takes a couple of minutes to unpack that. And neither the media nor the Democratic candidates have done a very good job prosecuting that case against the narrative that the president and the vice president use.
And look, we're all in the business of helping our clients communicate and helping people be more effective. Imagine if even 20% of the time that the president stood at his daily press conferences or his Rose Garden press conferences or everything that he's done, if he actually explained to people what Operation Warp Speed means versus just saying it. I think
Totally.
he brought that up last night. I just think it landed, and I would really be curious, but I have a suspicion that if you lined up 10 voters, they would not be able to tell you so again, it's just another missed opportunity for this president. I think the other one, I think we will be looking back at 2020 and these last 4 years. Certainly COVID is the overwhelming story, but 4 years to come up with a plan for healthcare for all Americans, and the Republicans did not do that. Like it baffles me strategically why this administration and Republicans in Congress, after 4 years, have criticized Obamacare, but not come forward with a plan that they could run on to advance something forward. And I think people are going to walk into the voting booth not knowing what they stand for on the issue that is most important to them.
Well, and last night it's funny that you say that. Last night I happened to catch former Senator Rick Santorum talking about his frustration that Republicans aren't hailing their successes on healthcare more than they are. And he had a piece in The Hill kind of saying, look, you can tell the American people where you have made strides on chipping away at Obamacare, which has skyrocketed premiums in the private markets. Steele, what if you were working for a Republican politician at this moment? What would you be telling them to say about healthcare?
I would be telling them that you need to have 3 or 4 principles with some policy behind them to be able to say no one with pre-existing conditions will lose their coverage. We can have greater flexibility and lower costs, and that the radical expansion of the government option that former Vice President Biden is offering is the next step towards socialized medicine and losing the private health insurance that 180 million Americans rely upon.
Well, they should have been listening to you, Steele. I mean, you guys see this week, one of the Republicans' strongest candidates for Senate in my home state of Michigan went on and literally was rendered speechless when he was just asked what his plan is for healthcare. I mean, that to me, that's just malpractice, that issue, that Republicans would put candidates out there and not have them prepared to answer that question. I will say maybe the big winner of last night, besides Kristen Welker, are Republican candidates who now finally get a weekend to stay on track instead of being asked a bunch of crazy distraction questions from the president's performance last night.
This was a really good night for Senate and House Republicans. I mean, this is what this is what they wanted to see. They wanted to see the president offering a reasonable discussion of his COVID response, a reasonable discussion of energy policy, immigration policy, et cetera. This last night was a good night for House and Senate Republicans.
It just makes you wonder if 10 days before an election, if that's enough. And as we've said, what would have happened if that had been the way that the president had behaved for the last year.
One thing I want to ask you guys before we kind of turn and talk about the big picture is at the end of the debate during a conversation on climate change, President Trump challenged Vice President Biden and asked, what will you do about the oil industry? Will you take on the oil industry? And Vice President Biden said, we have to move away from big oil. And, I think he tried to make his point that it needs to be done over time and responsibly. But did that land? Do you all think that people in the energy sector are looking at Joe Biden and saying, okay, we have to be more scared of him than we were before?
No, I think that that was a gaffe by the former vice president. It was a mistake in a earlier in the process, or in a more normal election year. It could have been a costly mistake. I honestly thought it was less damaging than the bizarre attack that the president made on the former vice president for listening to American families and taking their concerns into account. That to me seemed a bigger misstep, a bigger gaffe. Again, if we were in a more conventional political environment.
And I think what we know, even from our clients, Megan, and all of us are doing this, is that every industry is preparing and thinking about how they are going to position in either the continuation of the Trump administration or in a Biden administration. So that wasn't really a remarkable, I don't think that did any change. Now, getting into talking about, that where they went from there and talking about fracking. I mean, one of the things that I think is always interesting to see is how are these issues playing on the ground in these states versus sort of in the national media and things. And, I think we'll see in states like Pennsylvania, what's, how voters are hearing that and how they're responding when they vote.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting just because, President Trump really, you could tell, felt satisfied with himself. Though something that I've always wondered about politicians on both sides of the aisle is why aren't they more articulate about an all of the above energy strategy? It just seems like something that eludes everybody. It's an economic argument. It's a national security argument. We certainly know that with working with our clients, certainly also in our time in government. I mean, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity that America needs to seize in front of us for our economic future, and somehow we still end up in this, like, are you the boogeyman or not? But anyway, moving along, so 11 days left. I was reading earlier this week, President Trump had his best few days of polling since the last debate in late September. Though we are seeing unprecedented numbers of early voting. Usually that looks good for Democrats, but this year it's totally different because people are scared about what is safe, what is the safe way to vote. So what does it all mean? What are we looking at over the next 11 days? Has this thing been decided, or do the candidates have to go out and make their closing arguments, and will that have an actual impact on the?
I think the race has been very stable. I don't think anything has changed. I think you always start to see a bit of a close and people, being more vocal about kind of where they're landing in the last days before the election. And look, I go back to, I think the Biden campaign for the last month has been making their closing argument. And I think it's been more erratic from President Trump and less disciplined. And, we'll see where those things land.
If the president is able to eke out a victory in the Electoral College again, if he's able to defy the odds, flat on his back, trailing in the polls, we will look on last night as the night where he turned it around and launched an effective defense of his policy, an effective attack on the former vice president. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think too many voters have already voted. I think that, as Stacy says, this has been a very stable race for a very long time, and I don't think that he gained a lot of ground. I think he stopped losing ground, but I don't think he gained a lot of ground. And I don't know how to make heads or tails of. I sort of feel like we should stop looking at any metrics that compare 2020 turnout, absentee, et cetera, to any previous year, just because this year is so unprecedented, so different. I wish that more states allowed counting absentee and early ballots before election day, so that you could go into election day with more votes counted and more certainty on election night. That's what we do in North Carolina. You'll see, if you watch election night in North Carolina, you'll as soon as the polls close, you'll see a huge Democratic victory taking place. But that's all the early and absentee votes that then get whittled down through the course of the evening as the in-person votes, who are more likely to be Republicans, get reported and counted. I think that's a smarter way to do it, because I think that one of the biggest worries going into this election day is a period of profound uncertainty in the days and weeks and God forbid, even months that follow. So,
Yeah.
the thing that I hope for more than anything else is an unambiguous result.
Yeah, I think, to steal one of Steele's points there, I think the only thing that we can look for with past as precedent is in previous years, you could be 10 days before an election and you could have a game-changing moment. To Steele's point, like, will this be the moment that things changed for President Trump? This is not that election. And I think even if somehow, the president defies the odds here and pulls out a victory, I don't think it'll be attributable to anything that has happened here in the last 10 days. I think it'll be that people had a sentiment that they were not expressing and that they had made up their mind before that. And there will be a lot of soul searching all around on sort of how campaigns go forward if that is the case.
Okay, so last questions and just quick answers. When do we know who's president, and when do we know who is in control of the Senate?
I think we will know both. I think we will know both within 24 hours. And I still see a highly likely scenario where we know the outcome on election night. Maybe not on the Senate. If you go state by state, to Steele's point, not all the states vote, but I think there is still a high chance of a very large electoral college victory for Biden, and that will be decided.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for example, if you see North Carolina and Florida go to former Vice President Biden, there's virtually no chance that President Trump wins another term, and we should know that. I always have to remember the Panhandle counties in Florida and the Central Time Zone, but we should know that relatively early in the evening. So if it's going to be a big night for Biden, we should know fairly quickly. I'm thinking through the time zones on the Senate races in my head. I don't think you'll know the Senate. It's tough to see a Democratic blowout in the Senate that is so bad that early on election night, particularly, and I always bear in mind that both of the Georgia seats are very likely headed into a runoff.
And then you get into places like Texas and Kentucky and Colorado, and some of those, and keep heading west.
I don't see how you know. You certainly don't know before polls close in the mountain states. And then, I mean, it could, even in a good Democratic year, I don't know that you have, because you assume Tuberville wins in Alabama. I throw up my hands about Alaska. I literally know nothing about Alaska, and you could see that
all 150,000 votes in Alaska.
Right. I mean, I've been there, so I'm better off than most Americans when it comes to Alaska. But
But you're bullish on Tuberville. You think Jones is done? Okay.
Yeah. But even on a good night with that, Senate could take a little while. I hope we're not waiting on the outcomes in Georgia to determine the majority, because I believe those runoffs aren't until January.
January, yeah.
First week in January, and I believe that you have to clear 50%, and there's some third party candidate in the Purdue Ossoff race, so Purdue can win but not get 50%, and then the 4 candidate race, the Loeffler seat, will definitely go to a runoff.
Yeah, there is a couple of scenarios. Steele pointed one of them out. If President Trump doesn't win Florida, and Florida is a state that we will know in the 10, 11 o'clock hour because they count their absentee ballots ahead of time, right?
Yep.
If President Trump does not win Florida, his path to victory is very hard.
Yeah.
Well, we won't have too much longer to find out. 11 more days, guys. Well, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode of HPS Insights. Special thanks to our guests today, Stacy Kerr and Michael Steele. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies work in our podcast at www.hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insights. I'm your host, Meghan Pennington, and thanks for listening to HPS Insights.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insight and visit us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.